So good evening, folks. Welcome to tonight's webinar on growing tomatoes. And so tomatoes are like one of those vegetables. It's kind of like the queen of the garden. It's the gold standard. If you can grow a good tomato, that's like a badge of honor for us gardeners. So here I'm going to give you a bunch of tips and tricks on how to go about it and get the best results possible. Growing tomatoes. So if you'll notice on the screen here on the image, all these different shapes, sizes, colors, flavor profiles. We're going to be looking at the best tricks that I've come up with in my 20 years of growing my garden here on getting the best results out of tomatoes for our climate here in Kent County, New Brunswick. So sowing time, the time to plant your tomato seeds would be in April. Best time to do it. You don't want them to get too big and so we start our tomatoes in April, and by June, by like our last frost date, I might have mentioned it in previous sessions. Our last frost date officially is on May 24th. However, being in New Brunswick and the climate, the weather out here is about as predictable as, it's not very predictable at all. Oftentimes we'll get some frost after our last official frost date. So I've often found it very useful to either wait until around June 10th to bring our tender frost-sensitive plants outside. Unless you use frost blankets, or if you're in a greenhouse, or you have some kind of protection from frost. You want to watch out for the full moon. Oftentimes they say that the full moon brings some frost, and oftentimes it'll bring a cold night. It has something to do with the tides. It brings air masses, something to do with the ocean. I'm not quite sure how it all works, but oftentimes, if there's a full moon, especially in the beginning of June, it'll bring, it's a very good chance you'll get a frost during that night. So make sure to have some kind of protection. If you have any plants outside that are tender, keep them covered. If you have a little bit of patience and you want to wait a little bit, until after that date. I know we have a very short season, so we're kind of eager to get those out into the garden early. But sometimes that risk pays off. Sometimes it doesn't pay off at all. And if we spent a month or two growing our seedlings, and then we put them out, and then you're all done. You're all gone there. That's happened to me many times, and it's very, very sad. And I would hate that to happen to any of you. So if you are ambitious, you want to get them out a little early. Just make sure you have some frost blankets and some kind of protection. There's cloches. It's like a cloche, it's like a glass cover, or you can take a clear bin, put them over top of your tomato plants, or even just a little hoop house, with a clear plastic, some vapor barrier or something. Just make sure that any frost protection that you have does not come into direct contact with your plant, because where the frost blanket touches your plant, there's no frost protection at all. It's this space around your plant that'll offer your frost protection. Frost moves across the landscape like molasses. So what it do is it settles down. It comes down from above. It kind of looks like it's kind of like a snow. It comes down from above. It'll sit on the surface and then move along the landscape, moving towards your low spaces. So if you're in the bottom of a valley, like me, I'm in the bottom of a river valley out here. And we often get some of these issues with frost that come in late in the spring, and then we get frost early in the fall. So frost protection, like for me, is one of those things that I have to really be careful for. But if you're on a hillside, if you're a slightly higher elevation, you might not have so much problem. So moving on, there are two different types of tomato plants out there that we can grow. There's your bush type determinate tomatoes. they Romas and plants like that. Like usually those are your paste tomatoes and that kind of stuff. So they'll grow a certain height. They'll give you one flush of fruit, and then they're done for the season. And then you have your indeterminate tomatoes. These are your climbing tomatoes. Those are typically used commercially to climb. Oftentimes they'll use those. They'll train them on a string to climb up on a trellis. Oftentimes your greenhouse tomatoes will be indeterminate tomatoes like that. And so the two different plants have different pruning and trellising needs. So you want to take that into consideration. So if you're going to buy some tomatoes, be sure to check whether it's a determinate or an indeterminate. Usually your seed packet will tell you. If not, you can always do a search online on your variety. The seed supplier will often have that information on their website. So the tomatoes on the right over there, those are sweet million. They're very vigorous bush. They grow very tall. They produce a whole bunch of tiny little cherry tomatoes. There might be like 40 or 50 different little cherry tomatoes on one. It's like it almost looks like a cluster of grapes. They're so full of different little tomatoes like that. Very delicious, very sweet, very nice. But they need to climb on something. You can't let them roam on the ground. It just destroys the plant. And the bush varieties, often you'll see those grown like on the left in those tomato cages. But you'll notice here, I want to point out, like these tomatoes over here, there's not very many leaves on the bottom. The fruit is there and it's starting to ripen. But you can see that they suffered. They had some issues, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So determinate tomatoes. Pruning a determinate tomato will often reduce its ability to produce its fruit. So it might not produce as much fruit if you prune your determinate tomatoes. Here we're talking like Roma tomatoes, like used for paste tomatoes, Amish paste, Scotia, a bunch of different varieties like that. So what happens here is, like, oftentimes we hear about pruning suckers off of a tomato. So we'll see how to identify a sucker on a tomato in a minute. But here, the suckers are actually, they're little branches. So in a determinate tomato, it wants to make those branches to create more fruit clusters and give you a larger flush of fruit. So if you remove your suckers, you're actually reducing its ability to produce as much fruit as it could have otherwise. So the only place that you want to prune your determinate tomatoes, and the same goes for indeterminate, there you want to prune those as well at the base of the plant. You want to think of tomatoes like a lady wearing a skirt. They have lovely legs. You want to leave those beautiful legs out in the open so that the wind and the drafts can come through a little bit and dry out the stems and the leaves. If it's very tight, dense leaf clusters in the bottom of the plants, they'll often stay damp after a rain for longer and be much, much more vulnerable to blight. So oftentimes, I don't know if you've seen blight before. Most people who grow tomatoes will have issues with blight. It's the tomatoes the leaves turn yellow, and then they get brown spots, and the leaves just dry out and die off the plant. This is a contagious issue. It's a fungus that grows, basically it's all over the ground. So every piece of soil, there's no garden out there that does not have blight spores on it. So you want to make sure that you don't create the conditions on your plant that invites that infection. So they grow typically around 36 inches tall. So you can always set up different trellises and different support structures to hold them up. You want to keep your tomato plants off the ground. Also to prevent, like I mentioned earlier, with that blight issue. Well, if your branch leans on the ground, well, it's very vulnerable to blight again. And also, any tomato that touches the ground will be hit by slugs and ants and other bugs. So it's so much better to keep them off the ground. It gives you a much cleaner fruit, a much healthier plant, and much better productivity. So they produce only one harvest per year. Now that harvest might take a period of time. You might have like a 5 week period where the fruit are producing and they want to ripen. But unlike indeterminate tomatoes, and we'll see that in a minute, indeterminate tomatoes only stop growing. They just continue to produce as long as they don't get hit by heavy frost or afflicted by a very bad disease. So typically, determinate tomatoes would be the tomatoes that you would use for preserves and making sauces and paste and dehydrated tomatoes and that kind of thing. So one of the systems that I like to use as a trellis to hold up my determinate tomatoes would be a Florida weave. So the beauty of a Florida weave, first of all, it's cheap to make. It's basically sticks and string, okay? So, but you want to have a solid stick, right? You don't want a flimsy. I saw some people showing these images online of their Florida weaves and saying, it doesn't work. But then they only use a tiny little stick that's like a 1x1 piece of wood that snaps as soon as the plant is so full of fruit. It gets heavy, and when that heavy fruit, after a while, if there's a little bit of wind or whatsoever, the plant will want to lean over and just it'll pull your trellis down if it isn't solid enough. Now, in the kind of winds that we go through here on the coast, particularly those of us who are right on the coastline or who live in the estuaries along the lagoons, those areas have a tendency to be very windy. So you want to make sure that your trellis is very solid. So typically what I'll often use is T-posts, especially on the ends. Good solid steel T-posts. You can pound them into the ground at least 1.5 feet, 2 feet deep so that they're well anchored. And the following sticks in between. If you have enough T-posts, you can use T-posts. I oftentimes go into the woods and I'll cut down a bunch of red maple little saplings. Oftentimes they grow into just a tiny little saplings that are about 2 inches, 3 inches thick, and they make a great inexpensive option if you have the option of going into the forest and collecting some. But there's other options like that. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be recycled stuff. It could be like bed frames. It could be all kinds of different things like that. I've seen all kinds of very creative ways of building trellises. The beauty of the Florida weave method is that it doesn't have a string that goes around, that ties around your stem, that might eventually choke out your stem. So if you have a string and you tie the stem and the stem gets bigger, it gets wider as it grows, it might get choked on a string. But here what you've got is a string on either side of the plant. So what you'll do, you'll plant your tomatoes. You'll have 2 tomato plants and then a stick. 2 tomato plants, a stick. And then what you'll do is you'll tie 2 strings along the base of the plant. As the plant grows, you'll add another 2 strings. And then in between the plants, you tie the front string to the back string together to prevent the plant from leaning out from one side or the other. Basically, the 2 strings hold it together. And if there's a wayward branch or there's something that's leaning someplace, you can always take little 2-inch or 3-inch long pieces of string and just tie on either side of a branch just to hold it in check. This kind of system here puts all of your tomatoes in a straight row, very narrow row. It's easier to navigate through your garden. You don't have branches leaning all over the place. It tends to keep your walkway much more open. And as the plant grows, you can add more strings. Every 7-8 inches, you can add another set of strings and just hold it up like that. I often use twine, jute rope, all kinds of strings like that. But you don't want something that's thin, flimsy, or those plastic twine that you can get at the store. Sometimes they'll get sun bleached by the end of summer and will snap at the worst possible time at the end of the fall, and then lay all your plants on the ground. That's that's happened to me too. So basically, I'm going to share with you all of my failures so that you guys don't have to suffer through the same problems that I've had to live through my my experiences here. And you'll also notice here at the base of the plants here, you have a layer of mulch. Now this is going to be very important. We're going to be talking about that in a lot more detail, but mulch, especially with your tomatoes, is really, really important. So as you notice here, the base of the plant's nice and open. You just see the stem below that first 8-inch set of strings. There are no leaves below there. So you really want to let that air flow below the plants. If there's airflow below, there will be airflow in between, in higher levels in between the branches and the leaves. Oftentimes the disease starts at the base and works its way up. So this creates a barrier, an area where there is no leaf contact or no possibility of mud from the ground to splash up onto your tomato plants. That's one of the major roles that your mulch is going to do here. I'll often use seaweed, eelgrass. You find those in the estuaries. After a storm, they'll collect all the black stringy seaweed that collects on the beach there. It's a fantastic resource that we have here. It does not have weed seeds in it that will spread all kinds of seeds all over your garden and sprout all kinds of different weeds, because it's an aquatic plant. There's no part of it that will grow in your garden. There's not enough salt on the seaweed to harm your plants or your soil, but there's just enough to make your slugs uncomfortable. And for me, that's really, really important. Getting rid of slugs like that, it's a major issue, especially if you have heavy clay soil like I do. Some of us have more sandy soil, and the soil has a tendency to dry out more, and you have fewer slugs. But when you have heavy clay, least bit of moisture, the clay stays moist, and the slugs just love it there. So using different mulches like that, mulches that repel your slugs like seaweed does, is a great addition. Now, slugs don't like the seaweed, but the worms, they love seaweed. So if you have an angler out there, you want to go find some worms to go fishing trout, well, you'll go dig around under the mulch in your tomato patch to find those. That's where you find that. So this is very simple, easy setup to make. You don't have to buy big expensive fence materials or anything like that. You don't have to have T-posts. If you find good solid sticks, saplings, alders, or anything like that, you could build it out of almost anything. So indeterminate plants. Now these plants, they keep growing, like I mentioned before. They keep growing until hard frost. So they can grow a good solid 8, 9, 10, 12 feet tall if you let them. Oftentimes in commercial greenhouses, they won't grow them straight up on a string. They'll grow them at a diagonal like that. So they'll grow on a cross so that they can have lots of room to grow their full length. And they continue to produce fruit. So as you see here in the image, the leaves are not around the fruit at their base. As the plant grows taller, they'll only let photosynthesize the very top of the plant. But below where the tomatoes are, they'll remove all of the leaves there, and to allow more sunlight to hit your tomatoes to help them ripen on the vine. Now, typically this is done in a greenhouse, not outside. In our climate, these varieties don't have the ability or the time to grow 12 feet tall. Usually, I've had some that grew 10 feet tall. Some very vigorous, like Sweet Million, for instance, is one of those that is very vigorous and will grow a good height during even our short season. And usually these are the tomatoes that you would eat fresh, like a slicing tomato for sandwiches and that kind of thing. And most of the tomatoes that we see commercially in the stores for salads and for sandwiches and stuff like that, they're all greenhouse indeterminate tomatoes like this. So these would be the ones that you would train up on a string. So when you're training a tomato on a string, you need to remove its suckers. You don't want it to make side branches, because you want to get as many plants as possible in as small a space as possible, especially in a commercial greenhouse. I'm assuming that most of us here don't have a great big commercial greenhouse, and we don't necessarily going to be doing this. But it's something that we have the option if we have a little greenhouse and we have enough room to put 3 or 4 of these indeterminate plants and grow them up a string, we can do that. The beauty of a greenhouse is that the rain doesn't fall directly on the plant. Now, in really humid weather, it can get pretty humid inside the greenhouse and still cause issues with blight. The spores can come in on the wind, but for the most part, the leaves stay dry and you have fewer instances of blight inside a greenhouse. So here, if we're looking at the image here, we got the main stem here. So what you want to do on an indeterminate is just let your main stem grow, and as the tip grows, you just wrap it around the string it's growing up. So you don't wrap the string around the plant, you wrap the plant around the string. So, but in order to do that, you need to remove your suckers. Now, suckers grow at the base of a leaf, where the leaf joins the main stem, kind of like in the armpit of the leaf. That's where your suckers are going to grow. And when small little like that, you just come in and just bend them sideways, and they just pop right off. They're really easy to remove. Now, if your main stem ever breaks or gets damaged, you can always train one of these suckers to take over as the new main stem, if need be. A sucker will take over the growth if the main leading growth is damaged. So typically on indeterminate, you'll have leaf, leaf, fruit cluster, leaf, leaf, another fruit cluster, and it alternates. 2 leaves, a fruit cluster on one side, and then 2 more leaves and a fruit cluster on the other side. That's how it typically grows, so you can plan ahead for its growth pattern, and you can be aware of where things are being produced. So now, harvesting. I would recommend, especially in our climate, we have tendency to have very hot, dry weather followed by big, heavy rains. The problem is that we want to ripen our tomatoes on the vine. We're always talking about in the popular media, vine ripened tomatoes are the best. But the thing is that once the tomato starts to ripen, its skin becomes less elastic. And then it gets hit by heavy rain. The fruit wants to swell with all of that water, but the skin doesn't stretch, so it cracks. And that's what gives you that image on the right here with big, ugly looking, the tomatoes taste just fine. Sometimes it'll rot, or it'll be, bugs will get in there. You'll have some ants in there and slugs. You have access to the pulp inside. But sometimes it'll heal over and it's fine. It's not very appealing to the eye when you put that in a salad or on your plate. So I strongly recommend to harvest your tomatoes once they're big, but before they start to ripen. So oftentimes before they start to ripen, they'll go pale a little bit. That's when it's time to remove that tomato. And you can bring those tomatoes into the house and let them ripen inside a cardboard box. You put all of your little tomatoes or your bigger tomatoes together in a box, cover them with a dish towel or something like that, just to keep the fruit flies off. What happens is that you can also add a ripe banana in there. The reason why the ripe banana is that ripe fruit exudes a gas called ethylene. So this ethylene gas permeates inside your box, covered by your towel to keep that gas in there, and it'll stimulate other fruit surrounding your ripe banana to ripen as well. So one ripe tomato in a box full of green tomatoes will help ripen the rest of the green tomatoes. So you want to keep a few ripe ones on the top near the surface to let the rest ripen, and go through your box often enough to make sure that there's no tomato rotting in the middle of there, and that'll just bring in fruit flies and cause all kinds of messy soup and stuff. You don't want to lose your tomatoes. You want to don't let them over ripen in the box. You want to take them out as they go. And tomatoes like this, once they're ripe, if you don't have the time or the inclination to process or make preserves right away, you can always just throw your ripe tomatoes in a Ziploc bag, throw those in the freezer, and then you can take them out later on to make your sauces or whatever recipes that you want to do with them later on. They freeze really well, and they're it's typically at our house. What we'll do is we'll just throw them in the freezer like that and wait till the cold weather comes before we start bottling our tomatoes and making sauces and tomato soup, and we even make our own homemade ketchup. Um, so we'll put those aside for later. And also, while the fruit is ripe in the house, well, we're eating tomatoes until they're completely done ripening them all, which can take sometimes into December, January. Easily, I've often by the end of January, I'm sifting through the last of our tomatoes. So and oftentimes, like last year, we harvested our last tomatoes on November 3rd. So, those green tomatoes on November 3rd, what might have took, 3, 4, 5 weeks to ripen in the box. And, so that gives you that how much amount of time to process them. So how to harvest your tomato. So if you notice your tomato, you got the little cap on top of the tomato, that little green cap there with the little tails. You want to keep that on the tomato. This is where it's like the belly button. It's receiving a lot of juices and fluids from the stem through there. So if you rip that off, it leaves some of those vessels open to the air, and oftentimes moist molds and stuff like that. It'll make it rot if you remove it. So if you look at the stem here in the photograph, a tomato stem has kind of like a weird little knuckle on there. So if you take your tomato, hold it in your hand, put your thumb on that knuckle and bend backwards, it'll snap on that knuckle and it'll keep that little cap on your fruit. Then you can put that, gently. When you harvest, you want to make sure that you're not chucking your tomatoes or banging them around or bruising them or anything like that. You want to delicately pick them up, place them in your bowl or your container or your basket, whatever you're using to carry the fruit when you're bringing it home. And just make sure that you protect the integrity of the plant so that it doesn't rot prematurely. You want to give it time to ripen so that you can make use of it, right? And the earlier you harvest your bigger tomatoes, it has more strength. It'll devote more of their strength. Instead of trying to ripen a tomato, it'll send more strength to fatten up your smaller tomatoes quicker. So if you harvest them as they're produced, as they get large, you'll probably be getting 10, 20, 30% more tomatoes by the end of the year if you do that, instead of letting them ripen on the vine and running the risk of getting split tomatoes, right? So, you get a more output if you harvest them green and harvest them indoors than if you wait for them to ripen on the vine. So these are images of our harvesting and our ripening operation. So oftentimes we'll just grab whatever boxes are lying handy. Oftentimes I'll go to the corner store and see if they have a couple of extra boxes if we don't have any in our house. Nowadays, everybody's getting packages from Amazon, so we got lots of boxes all over the place lying around. So you can always use those. We'll put some newspaper on the bottom in case a tomato bursts and gets all nasty and juicy and stuff. You don't want to make a big soupy mess on the bottom, so a little bit of paper at the bottom of your box will soap up a lot of that stuff. And you don't want to put it in too large of a container that it's inconvenient to sift through them to find your ripe tomatoes and take them out. So basically every couple of days you want to be going through your tomatoes and sorting them out and removing the ripe ones, letting the rest of the green ones ripen as they go. And sometimes if we have a whole bunch that are starting to turn red, but they're not quite there yet, we'll put them together in their own container and let them ripen fully, for a day or two before we'll put them in our Ziploc bags and put them to freeze. So, like I said, we often will bottle our tomatoes, we make tomato sauces, soups and stuff. But lately, in the last couple of years, we've been experimenting with dehydration. Dehydrating your tomatoes concentrates the flavors, and they're really easy to reconstitute. You put in the amount of water that you want to make the thickness of the sauce that you want. Instead of boiling your water away, you just add the water you need. And then you can either put a little bit of water and then make it turn into a tomato paste, or you can put more water and make it into a tomato sauce, like more of a saucy type of consistency. And but you don't want to put too much because then it's just runny and stuff. But the thing is that you can control for that. You boil them up and you just run them through a blender after that, and it just makes a beautiful tomato type texture and stuff. And it's the beauty of dehydrating it is that it's shelf stable for years. So oftentimes we'll bottle our stuff, and maybe the seal didn't take. We might lose 5-6 bottles out of a batch, 2-3 bottles out of a batch. But if you dehydrate and you keep them dry, you can put them in a Ziploc bag, vacuum seal them. You can do all kinds of different things like that to keep them nice and dry. They'll be stable for years, but your bottled tomatoes might only last a year and a half. So it's a great way, and I would encourage you to experiment with it if you could. It's very simple, much less labor intensive than bottling, and it's easier too. So problems with tomatoes. We talked a little bit about it a minute ago, but here we're going to dig deeper. So the two biggest problems that we see with tomatoes is tomato blight, as you see the image on the left, and then blossom end rot on the right. So tomato blight, like I mentioned earlier, is a fungus that grows on the soil. It's present in all soils. You want to prevent that rainfall from hitting the mud and splashing up some droplets of mud on your leaf surface. And then if it stays moist, if the leaves stay wet for a period of time, they'll eventually they'll develop these blights. And once the blight has taken on the leaf, it'll destroy that leaf. You may as well remove it squarely off of your plant. You want to take it off of your plant and remove it out of your garden. The brown spots are actually producing spores. So instead of worrying about them coming up off the ground and getting onto your plant, now they're in your plant spreading already there. So it'll spread for the rest of your plant if you leave it there. You want to remove those as soon as you see them. Now to blossom end rot, you got issues. Oftentimes you'll ask online and they'll tell you it's a calcium deficiency. So you'll see people taking Tums. They'll crush some Tums and they'll throw it around the base of the plant. They'll crush eggshells and throw it around. Or when they plant their tomatoes, to make sure that they don't have blossom end rot, they'll crush tomato eggshells and then put it in the ground and then plant your tomato in that hole. But the thing is that usually the issue that we see is not the fact that the calcium isn't present, is that the soil got so dry that the calcium got out of solution. It's now a solid, no longer available to the plant. So one of the major problems that cause blossom end rot is not so much lack of calcium, but irregular watering, and desiccation of the root system. The soil dries right out, and it might go a couple of days without getting any water. Oftentimes, the tomato is putting a lot of energy to create this fruit, and if there's any interruption in its nutrient cycle, in its water cycle, it'll fail, and the failure appears as a blossom end rot like that. So how do we prevent these issues? It all comes down to one solution: mulch. So if you mulch your ground, when it rains, the rain is going to hit your mulch, seep through your mulch, and then percolate into the ground and not splash up that mud, carrying those spores back onto your leaves. The mulch is a barrier, it's a physical barrier between the spores of blight and your plants that might be vulnerable to blight. This holds true for cucumbers and other plants and squashes and different things that also are susceptible to different blights as well. So mulch is a really, really important aspect. But then for blossom end rot, your mulch will also prevent it from desiccating, from evaporating all of that surface water out of the soil. It'll keep that moisture at the ground level, and the soil won't get so hot. I've often found I've taken infrared sensors and measured the temperature on the ground in bare soil gardens. And I've measured temperatures 50, 55, 57 degrees Celsius. Now that evaporates all the water that's present there. The top surface, half inch, 1 inch, might be bone dry. And if there's any roots trying to grow in that space, they're cooked. They get cooked. So that's it's very hard on the plant when we do that. Tomatoes are very resilient, but they need their consistent water. So adding a good layer of mulch, a good 2-3 inches at least of mulch like that. Now it can be seaweed, it can also be hay, it can be straw. If you use hay, it's a lot of seeds in hay. You have to go at least 6 to 8 inches deep of hay mulch in order for it to be effective, and not just simply to turn your garden bed into a hayfield, right? Because that's the big fear of using hay in the garden. It's the solution to that problem is just to use enough of it. You have to use a very thick layer of hay, but you can also use straw. You can use pine needles. You can use wood shavings. Different things like that. Wood shavings are not the best because you want to make sure that if you till your garden, you never want to till wood shavings or wood chips in your garden soil, because that'll lock up nitrogen it can take a couple of years before the nitrogen cycle is reestablished in that soil. It takes a long, soil bacteria needs nitrogen in order to decompose organic matter, and wood takes a long time to decompose. So that's where your nitrogen might get bound up. But there's, grass clippings. When you mow your lawn, grass clippings are a great resource for mulch in the garden for 2 reasons. One, if you mow your lawn, it doesn't have any weed seeds in it because your lawn doesn't grow tall enough. Some folks worry that little bits of grass will root, but that doesn't happen. There are certain plants that can root like that, but you'll find those more in a hayfield than in your lawn. The most things that you'll find in your lawn are possibly some dandelion seeds, but a good layer of mulch on top of that, they won't sprout so good in your garden bed. So these are just simple practices. Cover your soil. A bare soil, and a lot of us leave soil very bare. Bare soil evaporates water. You lose so much water, it's incredible. You're just always watering your garden. So if you cover that soil, your chores will be lessened. You apply a good layer of mulch. I like to wait until after the heavy rains in the spring are done and things start to dry out in July, before I start putting in my mulch, especially for me with heavy clay soil and the tendency for slugs. If I plant beans, for instance, and there's mulch around, there'll be slugs. As soon as the beans sprouts, the slugs will come in and eat them all up. And the same happens for carrots and cucumbers and all kinds of little seedlings. They're very tender and they're very tasty, the slugs. And as soon as they sprout, they get wiped out. So if you go in and then one day you see some sprouts coming up, and you come in the next day and they're all gone, likely it's slugs that are responsible for that. So it's best to wait a little bit until dry weather comes. It starts to come, in your last few rains. It's a bit of guesswork about that. It's a bit of an art, but that's kind of the adventure of gardening. Sometimes you take precautions and you just use your best judgment. And a good layer of mulch is a fantastic way to reduce your watering needs. It's a great way to make sure that your soil stays consistently moist so that the plants can grow without interruption, and avoid that dry and then soaking wet cycles back and forth like that, because that does havoc to your fruiting. While the plant is growing, it's not so bad, but once it's got fruit on it and it dries out, and then gets soaked in with big heavy rains, then dries out again for a couple of days, the fruit gets really damaged. It doesn't grow very well. It gets deformed, cracks, rots on the plant, and there's just a lot of issues like that. So good layer mulch is I would highly recommend to always mulch your garden.